the context of what is happening out in the world today, it feels weird making this video now since it covers a topic that is so meaningless, so completely unimportant that I sometimes wonder why I even made it in the first place. Why everyone was even upset about. My God, we are pampered little ungrateful brats, aren't we? But here we are. Let's talk about the Wankfest that was Dear Esther. I'm going to start by saying two things that you need to be aware of when you watch this video. Number one, I do not consider Dear Esther to be a video game. I do not even consider it an interactive story since it lacks any interaction with said story. There is no interaction in the game at all. Just look at these controls. There's nothing there. An interactive story would actually allow you to, interact with it in some way. Like, here's an example. The pick up that can scene from Half-Life 2. That is an interactive story. Devoid of everything else in the game, this is a story unto itself. One that tells you a lot about that Metro cop and about the world he lives in. You know, based on how he acts, that this isn't the first time he's done that, and it won't be the last. But the game actually lets you interact with that story. Will you comply? Will you fight back? Or realize that you can just jump over the trash can and then run like hell out of the train station with him chasing you all the way? That is interaction. That is a game. That is storytelling through gameplay. That is not what Dear Esther has to offer. It is a narrative that is told to you or told at you, to be more accurate. It does have the novelty of what is being said changing every time you play it, filling in details and maybe giving you a different interpretation of what the characters did, who the characters even are, who's telling the story, what even is the story. Okay, maybe not what even is the story, but still, it does that at least. It's a bit like Diablo 1 in that aspect, where its quests would not all be available in one playthrough, or like roguelikes in general. Their maps are randomized from blocks that are never in the same arrangement. Their items as well, but these are components that are used as part of a game, whereas Dear Esther stops at just that and nothing more. I've said before that Dear Esther is a video game in as much as standing in an empty field is a football game, or maybe walking in an empty field, if you want to be more accurate to what Dear Esther is. Number two, I think Dear Esther is absolutely beautiful. The cave sequence is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen made in the Source engine. Though the bit on the background is actually from the Landmark edition, which is made in Unity. It also has amazing music and the island itself is very well designed, giving a great sense of scale that just makes you wish it was used by an actual game. So where does the Wankfest part come in? Well, it's mostly from outside the game itself. Mostly, I mean, this is after all a game that has a Fibonacci spiral on a beach for no reason, so you know that it's wank in some proportion. And the narration itself, although it can be quite moving sometimes, often feels like pretentious wankery. And trust me, I know pretentious wankery when I see it. Not only am I a writer, but I've also been single for years. But no, most of the wankery comes from outside the game. It comes from the same two sources that stuff like this tends to come from every time. From the internet machine of chaos, and from people who should have known better and then did the opposite of knowing better. You see, Dear Esther wasn't the first creation of its kind to be released. Not by far, not even on Steam. The Path, for example, predates it as a commercial release, and No one had any sort of opposition about not calling it a game or mentioning that it kinda sucked, but hey, it tried to do its own thing, so more power to it. Then again, that was a title developed by Tale of Tales, a developer famous for having a massive meltdown after trying to make a game marketed at people who don't play games, only to realize that that doesn't work, and then proceeded to blame gamers for it. I'm not sure if I'll ever touch that subject, since most of the people involved seem to be either unstable or opportunistic grifters and all around terrible people. And even outside of Steam, people have been doing more narratively focused games for ages. Hell, Jason Roher was making experimental narrative games that would make Dear Esther look like a AAA mainstream title. And yet I would still call something like Passage a game, because it's actually got challenges and choices and a point to it where you're the one driving the actual narrative, or the same dream every day, or whatever that thing was called, that still made you choose what you did. Even though it didn't have much to choose from, it was still a game. Hell, if you want to go down that rabbit hole even more, there's been more experimental narrative titles on Newgrounds than on Steam. When Dear Esther came out, reviews were a bit all over the place. Some called it a boring slog, others said that it had value, but it's also kinda dull, while giving it an 8 out of 10 because hey, it still looked great, sounded amazing, and the story changing every time you go through it. Yeah, that's kinda neat. I mean, it would be neater if the story was more engaging, for it to actually entice you to play it twice at least, but hey, it's something. Some people in the press even started their reviews stating that this is not a game, at least not in a traditional sense, and some kept insisting that it becomes more engrossing and more of a game as the hours passed by. Though how can that be possible for an experience that clocks in at best at 1.5 hours of tedium is beyond me. The footage you're seeing now was taken from the landmark version of the game, which took me like an hour and a bit to go through. And that's with some backtracking and some time spent looking for those ghosts that show up from time to time and are completely pointless. So getting even 2 hours out of it is, as the kids would say, sus. But hey, that's game journalism for you, especially GameSpot. You can never be sure if the person writing the article didn't know how to play it, didn't play it, or had their article altered because, who gives a crap? Maybe they're a freelancer who doesn't have any final say in how the article actually looks, or they got fired after it. I don't make such allegations lightly. There will be a GameSpot Wankfest episode at one point. There's just a lot of it. But things were fine, or they were fine until people on YouTube started bringing up the idea that this isn't a game. And they weren't necessarily okay with it. I mean, Steam should sell games, right? Yeah, I know. Those were different times. It would be another, I believe, 2 years before we actually saw PowerPoint slideshows being sold on Steam. And I'm not talking about graphic novels, I mean actual slideshows. There was something called retention, which caused a lot of uproar when it was released. But it wasn't hip with the indie crowd enough to get any backing from the media or from anybody to come to its defense. Hell, those were times when Twitch was about video games. That's like they say, the past is a different country. One where a publication like Rock, Paper, Shotgun could allege that Dear Esther wasn't worth the price it was being sold for. But if Total Biscuit said it on YouTube, well then, this means war. The year was 2012. We were at the end of a very long console generation. People were tired of the same old, and the video games media was going through a period of uncertainty. I mean, what is even the point of a release day review when any random yabo could upload direct footage of an entire game? Maybe to offer insight, get people interested in games that aren't being discussed or aren't being given their fair shake. Like showing the masses what a beautiful, fulfilling, and deeply personal experience playing a philosophical, immersive sim can be, instead of complaining that people only want to play shooters, Susan. But no, not really. YouTube ended up doing that as well. There are dozens and dozens of channels out there built around the idea of creating deep, complex, and meaningful analysis of every aspect of a game, with videos that can stretch for hours upon hours upon hours. True labors of love which mainly can exist now because of Patreon, not because of the ad-supported business model that traditional media is bound to. So that's not something that the media could really attempt to do. Instead, they grasped upon something else. The very thing that ruined JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. They took a stand. I'm just saying Hamon was a better idea. In an instant, Dear Esther became the indie game darling, being shunned and disrespected by gamers. So here's the thing. Nobody likes pretentious snobbery in games, or anywhere for that matter, apart from the snobs themselves. Even in indie game circles, you have to be in a really airtight small bubble to not be laughed at for being a pretentious snob. Just a few years before this event, Loading Ready Run had created a fantastic sketch about video game snobbery, which would now, border on hate speech against people who can't make games, but claim to do so under the guise of art. And mind you, Loading Ready Run aren't assholes like I am. They're nice people, so if even they made fun of that trend, you know that nobody liked that kind of indie game developer. But when Dear Esther was being called not a game, that type of person felt insulted and began to speak their mind on social media. The developers of Dear Esther as well felt like people were saying that their creation was destroying video games and felt attacked. And as time went on and those developers began work on the sequel to Amnesia: Dark Descent, some of the media kind of went with that division, fanning the flames bit by bit for a good old-fashioned clickfest. I mean, just picture it. This isn't just some meaningless game. This was a highbrow affair. This was made by someone working at a university with a PhD. It was made by smart, educated people, not a dirty, savage game developer who sleeps under their desk. It was made by elevated individuals who rise beyond the shooters and create something that's never been done before, apart from all the times it's been done before. It was, and here is where the wankening began in earnest. Art. Oh, that word. Such a beautiful word turned into such a perfect tool for division. Fun fact about art: any expression can be considered art. It doesn't even need to be made by a human. An elephant can paint, and that is art. I dare anyone saying that it's not to do so in the elephant's face. Fallout. That is art. Legend of Zelda. That is art. Ultima is art. Pong. Though maybe that's just a sport, although at high levels maybe it can become art. So the whole notion that only stuff like Dear Esther or Gone Home or Passage or The Path being art by being deprived of the game parts is meaningless drivel formulated to get a rise out of people. It is a trap, one that has been very successful over the years because it is meant to feed off of shame. Off the shame of playing video games as grown-ups and having those not in the know tell us that it's a horrible way to spend our time, that there's no value in it, that any attempt to even consider games as being art comes at the cost of making art meaningless. This in the same context where any Michael Bay movie is as equally art as the Mona Lisa, Der Ring des Nibelungen, or Citizen Kane. Don't you worry, we'll get to the Citizen Kane of gaming at some point. That wankery deserves its own episode. But if the game has no game part, then it can be enjoyed by snooty self-entitled intellectuals who used to think that Mass Effect was a porno. That's gonna be an episode 2, quite probably. And on the other side of this made-up controversy, there are the people who feel personally attacked by snobs and clickbait who lash out in ways that the internet tends to do constantly. And quite predictably, as future events had, well, I wouldn't say proved, but used quite effectively. Over the years, this has snowballed, leading to not really much benefit to anyone in the long run, save for some mad clicks, and a warped sense of importance.
Is that it's something that people still feel is relevant, that, you know, even though it can be slightly frustrating that people are talking about, is this a game, is it art, can games be art, it did start those conversations, and they're conversations that weren't necessarily happening particularly often before we made the game. So yeah, I think to have made something with longevity in this industry feels like a massive achievement, actually.
Dear Esther is now credited as being one of the most pivotal games of the last few decades, though outside of some wankery bits of the media and some die-hard we hate games people, its cultural impact has not even been at the level of Slender Man, which in a lot of aspects is a very similar game, only that it actually has gameplay elements and interactivity to it, so it's a game. It just sucks. Although, maybe there is one positive thing that came out of this controversy. It has been quite good for this little experimental experience that a few people put a lot of time and effort into. It's why we're still talking about Dear Esther right now instead of The Path, for example, because the controversy drove it beyond any measure of success or relevance that it could have had on its own merit. Now again, not to diminish what Dear Esther achieved and the work of the people behind it, but without that attention, without the drama surrounding it, we wouldn't be talking about it today. This controversy is why the term walking simulator stuck around, a term that is considered a pejorative, yet it's still the best way to explain what mechanically Dear Esther actually has to offer, compared with something like The Vanishing of Ethan Carter or The Stanley Parable, who are sometimes also called walking simulators but have actual gameplay. Actual means for the player to interact with the environment, with the story. Hell, Death Stranding is a literal walking simulator, but it actually does it by focusing on the mechanics and intricacies of walking, not by being deprived of anything but pressing a W key. But much like a wish granted by an evil genie or a monkey's paw, this controversy has also been unfortunate in the long run a bit for the Chinese Room, the developers of Dear Esther, as they have struggled with crunch and burnout in their endeavors to make more complex games alongside established publishers. Sleeping under your desk isn't fun. I sometimes think back to all the energy wasted on the wankery that surrounded Dear Esther, that put it in a spotlight, and think, what would have happened if all that energy was spent on something that tried to be bolder and more constructive? What if Prey had gotten that attention? What if Among the Sleep had gotten that attention? What if Prelude to Darkness had gotten that attention? What if so many other small games that barely anybody has heard about, that people poured their soul into, had gotten that attention? What if?